Great. Welcome back, everybody, and welcome anew to those who are joining us for the first time today. My name is Paul Kolbe. I'm the director of the Intelligence Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Very pleased that we've been able to host these discussions today on climate change, intelligence, and global security. We've had 3 sessions so far, all of which focused on government perspectives on both climate change threats, government and former government, climate change threats, implications of a changing globe, changing world, but also on what role the intelligence community, US and a bit less internationally, has in informing decision-making around climate change issues. We've seen recent statements in particular from Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines yesterday that climate change is now at the top of US foreign policy agendas. But we've also known that it's been a key focus of businesses around the world, particularly energy companies, finance industry, et cetera, thinking about the implications of climate change, not just in terms of a security perspective, but in terms of long-term viability of their business models and businesses. Today, we've got a panel of experts from the private sector, entrepreneurs, analysts, founders of companies, authors who've thought about this deeply and are involved not just in thinking about it, but in working on it and doing things about it. We have Antoine Halff, who's the founder of Kayyros and the chief analyst for Kayyros.
One of the founders, yeah.
One of the founders, but a founder. He's a senior research scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, formerly chief oil analyst at the International Energy Agency. Kayyros is a Earth observation platform, impressive set of capabilities. We have Richard Jenkins, who's the CEO and founder of Saildrone. Saildrone is a company that produces seafaring platforms capabilities to provide measurements, data, information on what's happening both on and in the oceans with regards to climate change and other issues. Interestingly, company came out of work he had done designing and running a world land speed record wind powered vehicle with a stunning speed of 126.2 miles per hour for a sail driven craft, which is pretty amazing. I'd like to see it out on the lake in front of our house and see what you could get it up to out there on some ice. And we have Mekala Krishnan with the partner with the McKinsey Global Institute. She's most notably, not most notably, but with regards to this discussion, the author of an MGI research paper on climate risk and response, physical hazards, and socioeconomic impact. She's a researcher that has also been involved in research on inclusive growth, climate risk, gender economics, as well as her work on societal and physical risks of climate change. We're really interested today in just looking at what capability the private sector brings to thinking about and acting upon climate-driven national and transnational threats, what collection capability, but also what analytic capability. We also want to look a little bit through their eyes, through the lens of how CEOs, how boards are thinking about this as a risk, both short-term and long-term, and particularly how it might distinguish how government might draw upon some of these resources and what private industry might need from government with regards to these sets of questions. So with that, let me turn over first to Antoine for some opening comments. We'll go around the table and then open up for discussion. Antoine, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I'm very honored to share the stage with the co-panelists. As you said, Kayyros is an Earth observation platform. Basically, what we do is that we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to process data from a great number of different sources, particularly satellite imagery, different satellites, but also local sensors, the social media through natural language processing, geolocation devices, and others. We are a fairly young company. We started about 5 years ago, and our focus at the time was really the energy sector. And we felt that the energy industry and energy markets did not really get the data that they needed, the quality of data, the scope, the variety of data, the timeliness of data that they needed from traditional sources for a variety of reasons. But we felt that there was an opportunity to tap the huge proliferation of new data from new sources, from satellites, from the internet, to provide transparency about these traditionally opaque markets. So we set out to do this initially by extending data sets that already existed, but that were incomplete or very lagged or somewhat dubious quality sometimes. For example, crude oil inventories, which were fairly well known in key OECD markets, but not so much in non-OECD markets in China and other emerging economies. But pretty quickly, we set out to generate data that did not exist at all, to track things that were never measured and never tracked before. Particularly greenhouse gases and methane is a particular focus of ours. We created the first global platform to monitor methane emissions, to track them, to identify them, measure them, attribute them to the sources in quasi real time on a pretty much global basis. So today we have a range of products that really deal with climate change. It's become a very strong focus of our activities and research. We cater largely to the energy industry, but also to other industries, including many energy-intensive industries, and government agencies and the financial sector and other users. And we have I would say, a menu of products that deal with climate change in different ways. I would break them down in 3 categories. We have what I would call decarbonization tools, measurements that help us decarbonize the energy system. Methane tracking is one example. So before, until recently, we couldn't really track methane. Methane was not really visible or could not really be easily detected. You could measure aggregate detection concentrations in the atmosphere, but not really individual sources. Once you do that, you can really start eradicating methane, and you can really have a big impact on emissions. But we monitor carbon dioxide, we monitor NO2, we monitor biomass and the sequestration of carbon in forestry, for example, through various tools. And then we have what I would call climate risk management tools that essentially deal with the risks of catastrophic events, of climate disasters, such as flooding or fires. We identify areas on the map that are particularly prone to flooding, or if there's a flood, we can quickly identify the most affected areas, help organize the response, and help the insurance industry, for example, deal with the risks, the new climate risks, and send the price signals to help mitigate those risks, prevent them, and deal with them when they occur. And then we have finally what I would call energy transition management tools. And those are different from the climate risks tools. Those are risks associated to the transition itself. The effort to combat climate change, such as were outlined yesterday at the climate summit, really entail a massive transformation of the energy system in a very short amount of time. And to do this is extremely disruptive in many ways. If you look at the plans of some of the energy companies to increase their renewable energy capacity, for example, this is a massive undertaking in a very compressed period of time. And that means huge disruptions for the individual companies, for the trading community, a lot of risks, very difficult to manage, that require tremendous amounts of information, data, and data management capacity. So this is what we provide. We provide a platform that tracks a lot of the dimensions on which those changes are playing out. And we help the trading community, among others, deal with these changes. Energy trading is changing from a trading organized on silos, on verticals, natural gas on one side, crude oil, refined products, electricity, renewables, into a much more portfolio trading approach, where you have to arbitrage not only different places and different periods of times, but different fuels that compete with one another. So we had to deal with that. And basically, we're really convinced that geospatial observation and new data technologies are absolutely essential to the energy transition, to managing the risks associated with climate change, but also to help implement, to help achieve the climate goals that the world has set for itself, including yesterday, and to really bend the curve of emissions. You really can't do it without new data technologies. That's an essential part of the effort.
Thank you, Antoine. Fascinating set of capabilities, and I love the clarity of the approach. I'll have some follow-up questions there. Let's go to Rich Jenkins. Rich, over to you.
Yeah, hi, Paul. Thank you. So yeah, Saildrone make unmanned autonomous surface vehicles for ocean data collection. They're powered by wind and solar and capable of extreme duration missions up to 12 months in the open ocean. We collect many types of data, from bathymetry for mapping to oceanographic and atmospheric data for weather and climate modeling. Now, the oceans are really driving our weather and climate through the rate of absorption and rejection of heat and carbon dioxide. The oceans absorb most, or not most, much of the heat and CO2 that we produce, and this mitigates the effect of climate change. Understanding the rates of climate change gives us much better ability to predict the future weather and climate. So the Saildrones measure these critical ocean variables, and then including surface fluxes, and then transmit that data in real time back via satellite. So if the oceans continue to absorb carbon at the rate they are, this will delay atmospheric warming, but the oceans get hotter and more acidic. This has a dramatic effect on the food chain and also sea level rise. But if the oceans were to slow or stop absorbing CO2, then atmospheric carbon would spike and accelerate atmospheric warming. So it's really kind of a bad scenario of both scenarios, but understanding the rate of change is crucial to create meaningful predictions for our future, which hopefully can in turn help change policy and hopefully encourage actual actions. In terms of threats from climate, I think there are two types of main threats. There's threats to humans globally, and there's threats to national security locally. On a global scale, then warmer waters will feed more frequent and more intense storms, while sea level rise and increasing temperatures will likely displace billions of people. From a national security perspective, there's many applications, but one of them is dwindling fish stocks are pushing illegal fishing and unregulated fishing to new levels, closer and closer to home, threatening not only our food supplies, but also a significant economic asset. We currently deploy Saildrones to monitor fisheries and marine sanctuaries using machine learning to visually spot illegal fishing boats while simultaneously assessing fish stock abundance with active sonar. However, I think it's probably the Arctic that will see the most dramatic change in the next decade. The rapid reduction in the ice coverage allows access to new areas that were previously inaccessible, providing opportunities to harness natural resources and also opening up new shipping routes. Saildrones have been patrolling the Arctic on science missions during the unfrozen summer months for the last 6 years, and we're recently seeing considerably increased activity in the area. I think we need to dramatically increase our ocean monitoring, and specifically Arctic monitoring, to really protect US interests in the light of climate change.
Thank you, Richard. My mind is boggling at some of the possibilities of the capability that you described. And I could also imagine that not all parties will look on your activities as benignly friendly. You could imagine folks being quite threatened, particularly those running illegal fishing fleets and stripping resources from different places, might take issue with your capability and work. So interesting set of complexities that you've got to deal with there. Mekala, let's go over to you.
Great, thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this panel, and really fascinating discussion we've been having already. I wanted to maybe talk about make my remarks from two vantage points. One is, as Paul mentioned, I'm part of the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey and Company's business and economics research arm. We're essentially the think tank that sits inside of McKinsey. And as part of that, we've been doing a variety of research on both physical climate risk, but also thinking about the socioeconomic impacts of the climate transition. So I want to talk a little bit about that, just as framing, and then talk a little bit also about what we're seeing in the private sector landscape. So we obviously, as McKinsey and Company, spend a lot of time with companies across the world, and some of the developments as companies think about understanding and managing these risks. So firstly, when we think about physical climate risks, we did a big piece of work that we launched in January of last year that was trying to understand the nature and magnitude of physical climate risks. And part of why we did this is, if you look at a lot of the discussion in the climate science community, in other research that has been done, it often treats this risk as something that's happening in the second half of the century, something that's out to 2100, and something that's all about sea level rise. And what we wanted to try and understand is, what are the risks in the system today? What does the science tell us, but also how does the science interact with human beings, with how does the changing climate interact with human beings, with economic activity, with the capital and wealth we've built across the world, to try and understand the extent of risks that we experience. And what we found was a few, I think, quite surprising things. The first is, when you think about the nature of these risks, what they do is to interact with a range of physical systems. They affect human lives, livability and workability. Our ability to live, work outdoors is affected as heat and humidity conditions rise. They affect physical capital, so things like the building that all of us are in. They affect infrastructure services, which I distinguish from physical capital, because infrastructure services also then have knock-on effects through the economy as a whole. They affect food systems, and they affect natural capital. Now, in some ways, that's kind of an obvious list, but if you stop and think about what this list is, these are essentially the factors of production in an economy. If, as an economist, if you think about GDP, it comes from human capital, physical capital, natural capital, and those are the very things that a changing climate affects. So it fundamentally affects our lives and livelihoods. It is a non-stationary form of risk, meaning risk today is not the same as risk in the future, and that matters as you're making long-term decisions. As companies are thinking about where to put down their footprint, as countries are making big infrastructure decisions, we need to understand these decisions, not just in the context of today, but also in the context of the future. It's a systemic form of risk. Risk in one part of the world can easily spread to another part of the world. As we've discovered, pandemics also are a form of systemic risk, and the climate can have much of the same impacts, whether it's through connected financial system, connected economic systems, connected social systems. So I think these are important nomenclatures that we need to start to bring into the climate risk debate. Non-stationarity, spatial, Antoine, you referred to this as well. We need to do analysis of these risks in a spatial way, which is not typically a tool that one uses when one does risk analysis, the systemic nature of these risks, and frankly, the fact that we're underprepared for many of these risks. So risk is here today. Risk will only increase by 2030. Climate science also tells us that some amount of warming and risk buildup is guaranteed regardless of what we do for mitigation because of inertia of the Earth system. So there's some amount of risk that we're going to have to manage regardless of action we take on mitigation. So that's the context. Now, the good news is we have a lot of tools, and Antoine and Rich talked about other tools. So I don't want this to be all about doom and gloom. I think that the good news is we have capabilities that can help us do these forms of risk analyses. I think the imperative it creates for stakeholders, in my mind, is four things. The first is integrating climate risk into all decision making. So this cannot be something that happens in its silo. And we're seeing this now as companies think about responding to these risks. These risks are now oftentimes not the responsibility of a sustainability function. They're often the responsibility of a risk function, of a finance function, of the CEO of a company. This cannot be something that is a side project. You need to think about it. And when you do capital planning, when you do supply chain management, as cities think about urban planning, needs to be part of all decision making. And that's because assumptions of a stable climate are implicit in every decision we make. As we make long-term investments, as we build capital, as we think about where to grow our food, all of these decisions have implicit in them some form of climate assumption. And so we need to integrate it into all these decisions. That's number one. The second is adapt to manage the risks that are in the system. As I said, some amount of risk buildup is guaranteed regardless. And so we need to think about how we adapt our systems to be able to manage these risks. The third is, of course, the decarbonization imperative that this creates. And then finally, managing the transition risks that Antoine also alluded to that ensue from shifting our current state of energy and land use to this future state. So I say all of this because as we then think about companies, there's two roles that companies play in my mind in managing all of these risks. The first is managing their own exposure to these risks. And we're starting to see increasingly companies recognize that they need to do this. Sometimes they recognize this because they are in jurisdictions, in geographies that have seen increased frequency or severity of events. Think things like the wildfires in California, the wildfires in Australia. We've started to see companies actually get affected as a result of these risks. And so there's a recognition that they need to do something to manage their own exposures. The The second reason we're starting to see companies respond is increased attention on the part of regulators and investors that are asking companies to do better understand, measure, disclose on these risks. So all of this is creating increased momentum on the part of companies to both improve their data, improve their analytics, improve their disclosures around risk assessments, risk management. So that's one kind of movement in the field. The second is, of course, the role of the private sector in actually providing these forms of data, providing these forms of analytics, providing these forms of risk management tools. I think on both these domains, as Antoine and Rich have already alluded to, we've started to see private sector play a big role, both in reporting and managing, measuring their own risks, but also in being a part of the solution. We can talk more about that as we get through the discussion, but I'll pause now.
Great, thanks all three of you. Really provocative and fascinating set of issues that you've brought up. I've got a bunch of questions, and we'll ask the audience to start just typing into the Q&A box questions that you may have. But let me just start off with one about markets. Your companies, were founded to respond to a market, and in some ways, I suspect you're probably also creating a market. I think it was Antoine that said, we're producing and discovering data that didn't exist before. And I suspect that data, once it's revealed or becomes available, in turn drives its own set of questions and that. But can you talk a little bit about what is the market for the various types of climate change intelligence, whether it's kind of hard data driven pieces that Richard and Antoine are producing, or the kind of the more analytically focused pieces that Mekala is talking about. So is it a robust dynamic market, or is it niche, small, and can you characterize it a little bit?
Antoine, I can say talk about from the ocean perspective. Ocean's a bit like space was 10 years ago. It's such an expensive medium to get to that traditionally only the government have been afforded to do it. The story with SpaceX, they reduced the cost of access, and now it's a much larger industry. I think ocean's the same way. Up till now, we only have government research ships and Navy and Coast Guard that can really afford a $200 million or $1 billion ship to go into the ocean to get that data. And because of that, the data market for ocean is a very government-centric market as buyers, and that's rapidly changing as commercial applications like Saildrone, like other unmanned systems, get data from the ocean. So I think it's a rapidly changing data play, and there are lots of folks doing these incredibly clever industries of data, as we're talking about here, risk analysis, data merging to give us new insights. So I think we're very much on the data gathering side. It's a very difficult thing to do to get precise climate quality data out of the oceans. I think we're seeing a dramatic change in the buyers in that data, literally in the recent months.
And are the customers for that data, are they primarily commercial, private sector, or governments? How do you see that evolving?
Yeah, the message here is changing from government to private sector. It's been traditionally a government industry because government can only ones who can afford to get the data with old technologies. And as we transition to new lower cost technologies, it makes the data more affordable to private companies. So I think like SpaceX, you've seen the microsatellite industry balloon, as it were, with the cheaper cost of launch. I think likewise, you're going to see a lot more weather intelligence and climate intelligence folks spring up as we reduce the cost of access to the oceans.
And what are some of the uses of that data that companies haven't thought about or are just now awakening to? I suspect you've got a whole spectrum of customers, some quite sophisticated and some wondering, well, cool, but what do I do with it?
And absolutely, it comes from, our customers range from what we call core products. If they want a map of the ocean floor, we go and get a map, and they want products what we call a core product, which we deliver. And then there's a more data products than intel products. The data is the raw data which folks use to analyze weather and do modeling. And there's intel, energy pricing, energy hedging. As we transition to renewable energies, you want to know the more accurate availability of sun and wind and so on. Commodities, insurance, risk analysis of storms. And we're sending 6 vehicles into the hurricane season this year off the Caribbean to really try and get more intelligence into the intensity of those storms and where they're going to land. Obviously for the insurance industry and also just human safety. being able to give adequate warning ahead of landfall of a storm is crucial. So it all comes from a data play in our perspective, getting data which translates into really valuable knowledge.
And do you transmit or do they transmit the video and photographs and everything, or is it all sort of sensor based?
We have cameras and machine learning on the vehicles and GPU compute, which actually spots things autonomously. But yes, everything's transmitted in real time via satellite.
Well, I suspect there's some really cool images that come back from that, and I'm waiting for the one that shows like a huge set of teeth coming up, to devour your craft.
You see a lot of animals, so whales, dolphins, seals, hitch a ride now and again.
What's been the biggest surprise from your standpoint in terms of what you hadn't thought about, but which your craft and capability are revealing?
That's a good question. I mean, the biggest surprise is that, I guess, from a climate perspective, is the rates have changed. We measure dissolved carbon dioxide, PCO2, to 1 to 2 parts per million, which is what you need for accurate measurements of trends. And it's been going up, 4 to 5 ppm per year since we started. So I think the rates, and every year we go back to the Arctic, the ice is further and further north, the temperatures are warmer, and the fish stocks we're measuring are more dispersed because of the warmer waters. So I think from a science perspective, it's the rates of change in these regions like the Arctic that's most surprising to me, because I'm an engineer, not a scientist. We obviously give our data to scientists, but just understanding that rate of change is very, very significant.
Thank you, Richard. Antoine and Mekala, same original question.
Sure, I can, go ahead, Antoine.
Oh, okay. Well, I think to add to what Richard was saying, when we think about emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the lack of progress we've made so far, I think was driven by two factors: lack of knowledge, lack of transparency, understanding of emissions and their sources, but also lack of incentives. Climate abatement was a cost center for companies. Once you start to have transparency, you also have the possibility to create positive incentives, financial, economic incentives, and move carbon abatement from a cost center to a profit center. This is something that companies can boast of doing. We can now certify the carbon content of the methane emissions associated with companies, an oil field, a gas field, a cargo of crude, a volume of LNG. And the ability to do this lets companies extract a premium for good performance. So this is a nascent market. It's not a very mature market. It's just emerging as we speak. But you've seen some reports of transactions done on a bilateral basis between companies for carbon neutral crude or green LNG. We're moving rapidly to a world where we'll be able to have multilateral transactions with price discovery in open voluntary markets. So this is changing the conversation completely. The beauty, as you said, it's not all doom and gloom. The volume of emissions that we can see, particularly attributed to the oil and gas industry, is just massive, even larger than we thought. But the capacity to remove these emissions is here. Once they're visible, they can be removed. And they can be removed at a very negligible cost, sometimes at zero cost or even as a profit. So it's a kind of good story waiting to happen.
Thank you, Antoine. I think that the discussion, both the points you made about transparency, that knowledge drives action, but also opens up opportunity. And then your point on incentives and building in incentives is a piece of the discussion that feels extraordinarily important, and extraordinarily important to weave into the government discussions that are taking place between at the summits, and that this is not just going to be a kind of a top-down government-driven set of actions. To be successful, it has to really incorporate the private sector and incorporate the incentives in the real world opportunities that you talk about.
Yeah, and there's huge scope to decarbonize the oil and gas chain, the traditional incumbent fuels. We picked up about 9 million tons of emissions from very large events just in 1 year. So if you consider the global warming potential of methane is the equivalent to about 800 million tons of carbon.
Well, that monitoring piece as by itself feels like an extraordinarily important public good or potential public good in terms of a honest broker that can point out sources of emission, and just the knowledge of it then will help drive action, whether it's regulatory or enforcement or just reputational of, oh, whoops, we need to move on this. Mekala, over to you. Same question on markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if I think about what Rich talked about, it was really about measuring the impact of climate change. So that's one form of data and intelligence that we need. I think, Antoine, what you talked about is really about measuring our contribution to climate change, as it were, through emissions, right? And I think both of you made really excellent points about both understanding the pace with which climate data to understand the pace with which climate is changing and having impacts, and then also really robust point of source measurements and other forms of emissions measurements that allow us to do things like trade on carbon, allow us to certify carbon abatement, understand impacts, etc. There's a third kind of data, of course, which is also risk data, allowing us to understand our exposures to these risks. And if I think about the funnel of a risk assessment, what that essentially typically entails is some form of climate science data that allows us to understand in a probabilistic manner how what I would call climate hazards could evolve. So what's the likelihood of extreme rainfall today? How does that evolve going into the future? What's number of days above a certain temperature today? What's number of days above that same temperature in the future? So there's the hazard data. Then there's the analytics on the hazard data that's emerging. And this is typically some form of geospatial analytics. So it involves maps of what I would call hazard maps or flood maps or heat maps that one then can put overlays of a company's footprint or real estate footprints on to understand exposure of these assets or people to these hazards. And so there's an emerging group of companies that are thinking about doing that form of risk analytics to understand how hazards can impact different communities, different stakeholders, and not just direct impacts, but also ecosystem impacts. I mean, as another example of COVID, we saw that supply chain risks played a huge part in some of the experiences of countries during COVID. And so similarly with climate, it's important not just to understand your direct risk exposure, but exposure through your ecosystem, whether it's your suppliers, your distributors, your customers. And so there's a lot of heavy analytics happening both around the geospatial side of things, but also on the ecosystem assessment. Then the third form of analysis one needs, or data one needs when you think about physical climate risks is intelligence over and above that data and analytics, right? So once you actually look at the data, you look at the analysis, using that to change decision-making and understanding how to do that effectively. And so we're starting to see, various providers of the hazard data. We're starting to see some providers of the analytics data, but the analytics step, that second step that I mentioned, though there, I think a lot of the assessments tend to be more what I would call quote unquote first order assessments. So not really looking at the knock-on impacts, not really looking at the ecosystem risk. And then the final piece of actually using the data and analytics intelligently, I think is still very much an emerging arena.
Yeah, I think that, you put your finger right on a really important point, and it's the, doesn't matter how good the intelligence is, if it's not used or it doesn't get to the right decision maker at the right time in the right form, then it's not helpful. So I think that's a really strong point. Look, there's a couple of questions. Go ahead, Richard.
On that point of McKinsey, great point on risk. And I guess I see it as when you are assessing risk and also when you're trying to influence policy change and actions, the reason there is argument is because there's not agreement, even amongst scientists, there's not agreement at the rate of change because the models don't agree, the error bars are too large. So my goal would be to try and make those models agree through getting more data. And if you get more data and you can remeasure that in real time and you can compare model predictions against what's actually happening, if you can reduce those error bars so there's very little uncertainty, that's my best suggestion to enforce policy change at a government level, and also companies like yourself, which should hopefully significantly reduce the risk error, if you like, on the margin of risk on those proposals. So yes, we're measuring the effects, but it's crucial to measure those effects at a resolution, a spatial resolution and timely resolution, that you can get enough data to make precise models, so to try and get that disagreement to go away.
Thanks, Richard. We had a couple questions from the audience, and a couple of them converge around the issue of transparency and openness and accessibility of the data. So one in particular is, how can fragile and conflict-affected countries' governments facing climate change, and you could also substitute in energy transition challenges, draw from tools being offered by the private sector? What kind of infrastructure needs to be in place? How is the private sector cooperating with such countries to ensure no one's left behind? Anyone want to jump on that?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think the 2 points I would make is, on the one hand, we've talked a lot about private sector tools and data, and I'm speaking now more on the physical risk assessments, which is the area that I know best. There is, I think, a real debate about, should these data be public goods of some kind, or at least some form of these data become public goods, right? If you think about a climate flood map, if you think about heat map, drought maps, should these, ultimately these rely on climate models, many of which are free, open source, publicly available, albeit not something that, an everyday person can access and understand. But I think there is we'll see how the next few years play out, but I think there is a real question mark about the raw data itself, these raw hazard inputs into risk assessments. Should they be public goods that everyone can access, right? I think some form of these various platforms do try and provide data around, but I think they're not typically holistic across a whole range of hazards. They typically don't do things like a lot of a multitude of scenarios. They don't allow you to overlay your own footprint onto them. But there are some emerging public sector platforms public platforms that are trying to do that. So we'll see how that debate shapes out in the coming years. I think then there's the question of capability building, capacity building around using the data effectively. And I think there is some emerging work we're starting to see around private sector consortia coming together to try and develop best practice guides, develop tools and techniques and protocols and standards to do risk assessments effectively and well. And I think that is going to be really important as we think about doing risk analysis that is robust and takes into account some of these aspects of these risks that I described, right? The fact that it's systemic. So I think there's a new toolkit that needs to be built around robust risk analysis, and we are starting to see groups come together to form. It's typically happening industry by industry, like as a banking consortia, for example, but are trying to come together to establish the standards and the methodologies and the techniques and make that publicly available. There's of course a similar wave of effort also happening on the decarbonization side. So things like, how do you measure, if you're a bank, how do you measure your net zero emissions? How do you account for emissions? How do you reduce emissions effectively? Methodologies emerging around that are then publicly available, certifications provided around robust analysis or robust measurement that are, again, public goods and publicly available. So we'll see how much of how all of this shapes out in terms of standard and methodology development, but I do think that's an emerging area that will come to maturity in a few years.
I think you make a very good point, but I think we're entering a period of very interesting partnership, public-private partnership in data generation. The private sector has a key role to play, and I think the private sector is best placed to generate the innovation that we need to create data. And the input to our data in our company, Kayyros, really comes largely from public company, from public data, from the European Space Agency, from NASA. So data that are the raw data are freely available. We don't have any assets. Our contribution is purely on the algorithmic aspect, artificial intelligence, machine learning. And we've created, we've generated innovation that extracted from existing satellites a kind of information that the companies operating and that produce the satellites did not suspect could be extracted from them. So but at the same time, there's also we have an interest in sharing our data with the public as well. We have partnerships with non-commercial institutions, academic centers, universities, governments, multilateral agencies, where we share our data. And I think there's even from my perspective, it's not just data philanthropy, but there's a shared interest in having a common understanding of what the numbers are, what the climate impacts are around the world. And to go back to your question, Paul, about less advanced economic areas of the world, I think the data from non-traditional sources is pretty much universal in its reach. So we don't need to be physically there to provide transparency on markets in, let's say, Pakistan or Sub-Saharan Africa and so on. And the cost of data is pretty cost effective. It's pretty cost efficient. So we can actually, through satellite imaging and other new technologies, create transparency about aspects of the market that otherwise would require tremendous investment to produce by other means.
Yeah, I'll
Richard, any comment there?
Yeah, two good points. And Antoine's point on public-private partnerships is also key. We've deployed a great deal of venture money in a very short period of time to evolve a solution which is in an order of magnitude cheaper than the previous solution of a ship, for example. So using private funds, private equity to enable a service that the government can now buy as a service-based product, which is of extreme value to the taxpayer. And private companies can generally evolve hardware and software much faster than government labs can. So great public-private partnerships there, which goes directly into a good segue into one of our one of our large customers is NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Great organization. They are mandated, all the data they collect, they're mandated to share it publicly and openly, which is great. I'm a great believer in open data, but I guess people just need to know the difference between, people get confused between open data and free data. Data is very expensive to collect if you want high quality, climate quality data. So someone still has to pay for it. But whoever's paying for that data can choose whether they want it themselves or whether they're going to share it. And that's really, in my view, the role for the governments is now to step in. Now that these technologies exist, if they can get data across the entire planet at a very low cost, let's get the data and let's share it for the good of everyone, including poor countries as well. So yeah, great believer in open data, but we shouldn't think that it's free to collect it. It's still a high technology product added in a tough environment where you experience costs.
Yeah, it's a great, when you say it, it feels well, obvious, but it's such a great just point that that I think folks forget. Open doesn't mean free. That there's great amount of both in investment and technology and effort that goes into building the platforms and the systems and that to collect the data. I mean, posing an analogous question back to the government colleagues, how does if the intelligence community is using its sensitive platform systems, collection mechanisms to gather all this data, is it only used, or should it only be used to inform a government audience, or a select set of decision makers within the U.S. government? And we talk about sharing across allies and adversaries. What opportunities and obligations are there for that? But you also you can think about a whole set of states and sub-state actors, private and public, that will be among the most affected by energy transition and climate change, but also and are most in need of the analysis capability that the data will drive, the intelligence will drive, but also are in the least good position to collect it themselves or use it themselves. And you could come up with example after example, and it feels like there's a lot of room for some creative thinking on the part of both public sector and private sector, and private-public partnerships is going to be a key mechanism for it in some way, shape, or form, to drive that benefit. So you don't have, entirely skewed structures of, the data or intelligence privileged versus those not. So we've got just a couple of minutes left. And I'll ask one last question for you each, and then we'll close out. And in advance, I just want to really thank you for being here today. Thank you for being involved in such an important and interesting field and driving such great work. I think I'd really commend folks to take a look at the report that Mekala talked about, produced in January 2020. What was it? What was the name of it, Mekala?
It was called Climate Risk and Response, Physical Hazards and Socioeconomic Impacts. Quite a mouthful.
That's it. But it's an absolutely compelling report, deeply researched, and and a great international perspective to it as well. So I thought that was important. So last question being here, what do you think governments can learn from private sector in tying analytics to intelligence to allow more accurate use for decision making? Is closer collaboration warranted, and what are there any examples that you know of this happening?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think if I were to describe at least two things that are happening in the private sector where there's an opportunity for the government to also learn more, I think one is an organizational point. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, where we are seeing at least some companies very thoughtfully think about who owns this function, right? This risk analysis, risk integration function within an organization. Where should it sit, and how much teeth should it have, right? So should it sit within sustainability? Should it sit within risk? Should it sit within finance? Should it be a cross-cutting function? And I think there's an analogy in government about who owns the responsibility of doing these risk analytics, given the cross-cutting nature of some of the problems we've discussed, some of the data gathering, as well as the use of the data. So I think that's an opportunity maybe for at least some reflection on the types of organizational structures the private sector is putting in place, and potential opportunities for learning from that. I think the second is just the nature of risk assessments that are occurring in many parts of the private sector. Not all. I mean, typically we're seeing it's industries that have large physical assets, industries that have long-lived assets, industries that have global supply chains, that are the ones that are at the forefront of this. But as they do these forms of risk analysis, there's a very systematic process that they're starting to undertake of understanding the science and really becoming not a climate scientist, but becoming proficient in the lingua franca, as it were, and recognizing the limitations of the data. As Rich said, there are uncertainties. You need to know what are true uncertainties, what are uncertainties that are within your risk parameters, within your risk appetite, etc. But all to say, there's a very systematic process of understanding the science, understanding the data, building the tools, the techniques, the capabilities to use the data effectively, and then thinking about shifting decision-making processes. So that end-to-end chain, I think there's a parallel with other types of intelligence the government gathers, I'm sure. But maybe there's also the opportunity to think about the processes, the tools, the techniques that are being put in place end-to-end, and what opportunities there are to integrate that into government decision-making as well.
Thank you, Mekala. Antoine.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that statement, and I think there's a lot that the intelligence community can learn from technologies and practices developed in the private sector. What strikes me at the same time is that the new technologies, new data technologies, are kind of commoditizing the intelligence, the content of intelligence, leveling the access to information. And I see it particularly in the private sector. If you take the oil and gas industry, for example, the trading community, you used to have a big disparity between large players with a big footprint, both geographically and across the value chain, and small operators with much less access to information, because most of the information was privileged and came from within the system. And the bigger footprint you had, the more intelligence you had in-house. The new technologies are really bridging the gap between the information haves and information have-nots. And that's in the private sector as well as in other areas as well, I think. It's also changing the governance of the private sector as well, because it's not just about the kind of information you can get and what you can see. It's also how you access it and how it transforms you and how it exposes you to public scrutiny. So the governance of the energy system is changing dramatically. And the role of investor relations, public relations, for example, is changing completely, because the information about companies' performance is no longer now dependent on the self-reporting of companies, but is accessible from third parties, sometimes faster than it is in-house.
Thanks, Antoine, and great point on the democratization of intelligence in this field and what that on the private sector and what that might mean. And Rich, over to you. Final word.
Yeah, I know I wanted at the final word. I know we've got a few minutes left. I'll keep it short. But yeah, agree with both points. I think there needs to be a kind of fundamental evolution of the way the government does things traditionally, and for good reason. They've liked to own hardware and train people and keep it under themselves. And I think as the private sector accelerates its learning curve and its ability to deliver new solutions, both in hardware and the data space and the compute world and the cloud compute, I think the government needs to be a lot more nimble and open to, at least testing those solutions across the board. And I think it's probably going to need a bit of reform of, nimble contract vehicles and ways to, to test new hardware, low risk, low cost solutions, to getting things in the field, to really looking at data quality without having to embark on a 5-year project, which may be the wrong path and be a very expensive cost to the taxpayer. So I just think they need to catch up with private sector in terms of nimbleness and open-mindedness to try new platforms, new systems, and then facilitate that testing in a short period of time.
Thanks, Richard. You managed to go from a really hard problem, dealing with climate change, to a really, really hard problem, making the government nimble. So it's, I think the first one is better to tackle.
Aim high, Paul.
Hey, look, thank you very much, Mekala, Antoine, and Rich. Really appreciated your time today, your comments, fascinating discussion, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.